What's going on, guys? It's definitely been a while since I did a hat format meta tier list, and I figured with Konami officially saying that at the NAWCQ, the Attack of the Giant Cards side event is going to be hat format, I figured now more than ever is the best time for me to make an updated tier list specifically for the 2025 NAWCQ, and in general, just moving forward with the regulation changes and things such as the erratas to cards are now going to be played in these past formats, and just changes to rulings and things being implemented, it can kind of change this format, though I will say hat format for the most part is one of the least affected formats in terms of all these changes, though there are some key things to note, and if you guys want to learn more about those things, I do have a video talking about that, which I will have linked in the video description, so you should definitely check that video out, whether that is, pause this video and go and check that out, or take a second and watch this video, and then afterwards go check that video out, as if you are planning to play in this side event, it is going to impact you. Now, with all that being said, if you're new to hat format or haven't played hat format since its time back in 2014, a lot of people have still been playing hat format to this day, and as a result, the format has definitely shifted from what it was back in the day. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of similarities and things like that, but there are going to be new innovations that either push the deck into stardom or even push them downward. So, as someone who has been playing hat format for years and years and years, and in general, my whole channel is dedicated to hat format, I figured I am definitely a good candidate to talk about this and hopefully give you guys some insight if you guys are trying to participate in the NAWCQ for hat formats, specifically in that side event or other side events moving forward if they continue to implement hat format. Now, this is going to be more focused on the actual meta decks, so that's why I'm kind of picking categories and stuff that are specifically suited towards the decks that you're more than likely to see, and that's because these are the decks that are consistently getting tops in more modern hat format online tournaments. So I'm not going to be doing the rogue decks or some of the off decks. Don't get me wrong, some of those decks definitely can surprise us and take some spots from time to time, but if you guys are curious about the more rogue options and things like that, or like lower tier decks that, sometimes pop up, you can leave a comment and ask me about that, and I will kind of give my opinion on it. But for the most part, I want to make this as consistent as possible for the top decks and the decks you should be expecting to see in some combination at this event. So going over the tier list I do have picked out for you guys, we have top picks. These are going to be the obvious standout decks that, no matter what hat format tournament you go to, you're going to see. After that, we have tier 1.5, which is obviously also extremely good decks. It's basically the same thing as top picks, except it's not really, it's not the namesakes of the format in a sense. Tier 2 is just slightly above tier 1.5, obviously, or I guess I should say below tier 1.5, and these are decks that, again, all of these can really top. It's just something about it. Maybe it doesn't top quite as much, or maybe it has a couple inconsistencies that make it slightly worse than the tier 1.5s. Moving on to tier 2.5, these are the decks that from time to time will top and are enough to get on our radar, but really aren't necessarily the, top dogs of the format. But don't get me wrong, they're still very good decks, and maybe just, again, a little less likely to be seen. And after that, we're going to have rogue category. These are the ones that will get maybe one top or two tops, but don't really show up as often, even though they will be represented in, a lot of different online hat format tournaments. One other thing I want to note is this blue category at the end that obviously aren't decks or anything like that, but there's some cards that you should be expecting to see, whether that's because of the shifts in, the new rules and stuff like that, whether these are cards that got erratas or stuff like that. Specifically, Necro Valley got a very big errata in modern times versus back in 2014, and that is going to affect a lot of decks, as well as things like Valor that back in 2014 lasted until the end phase, and now it lasts till the end of the turn. And these other cards, for example, Vanity's Emptiness, Kaiser Coliseum, Rivalry, I guess Rivalry also sort of fits into the category of cards that kind of got a buff from the new rule changes and stuff. But anyways, Vanity's Kaiser, Malcat, Wiretap, and I'll talk about Fossil Dino a little later on. These are cards that back in 2014 saw a lot of play. Specifically those 4 right here, they saw a lot of play, but in more recent times, they have sort of fallen out quite a lot. I've talked about Vanity's Emptiness in its own specific video, as well as in my intro to hat format video that I put out, I believe yesterday at the time of recording this. And it also kind of went over Kaiser and stuff. But in general, because there's going to be a lot of people who haven't played hat format in a very long time, but have seen these cards, back in 2014 when they used to play, there's a high chance if you're playing at this side event that you are going to see these cards just because people, remember it from back in the day. And because they haven't played in more recent hat format, there's a good chance that they aren't going to realize that some of these cards aren't quite as good as they used to be. Don't get me wrong, they're still amazing cards, but they're situational amazing cards, and Wiretap specifically still sees a ton of play, but at the same time, it's seen slightly less in the main deck. I know back then a lot of decks would play 2 to 3 of this, versus now in the main deck, you'll see a lot of people play 1, maybe 2, and then side, 1, maybe 2. So just keep that in mind that these cards are going to be, more prevalent, and there is other ones as well. Gozen also kind of falls into the rivalry category, and just a handful of other things like that. But without further ado, it is time to finally get into this tier list. All right, so starting this out, Hat. And Hat in general is obviously the namesake of the format, and as a result, it's the namesake for a good reason. The hands, artifacts, and trap tricks are all extremely strong, and in general, with the new rule changes and stuff like that, this deck didn't really get any sort of hits at all, and has always just been a top pick. Whether that's because, its consistency, or just in general, it plays, 3 of the best engines in Hat format, and is just undeniably a very well-rounded deck as a whole. And yeah, there's so much you could say about this, but at the same time, I don't think it really needs the biggest explanation. After that, we have Geargia Karakuri. While back in 2014, Geargia Karakuri was a very formidable deck, and it still is, I would say, in, more current Hat format. I will say that it kind of feels like it's a solid deck, but not quite the best in a sense. It definitely has its moments to shine, and given how I kind of grouped the categories, I want to say it's probably around a 2.5. Obviously, Geargia being very strong, but at the same time, I would say that, things like the Karakuri engine can be a little bricky at times, which can affect that. And just in general, I feel some of the more combo decks do have a little bit harder chance, simply just because also a lot of people are looking forward to playing hand traps a little more, specifically being things like Max C. And in general, in more modern Hat, at least lately, a lot of the hand traps have been moving more so to the side deck, but I could definitely see them being a little more prevalent in terms of actually moving forward into this side event, specifically, again, just because people were so used to seeing them back in the day. As well as, I guess, with the change to trigger locations and stuff like that and hidden information, Gear Gigant, if it's returned off of Compulse, will no longer trigger. And so that's also kind of a hit to that. And I'll talk probably a little more into that when we actually get to Geargia, wherever it is. It's right over here. But yeah, in general, it took fairly minor hits, but I could definitely say that it's a slightly lower tier in terms of stuff like that. Next up, we have Constellar Artifact. This is a deck that's definitely risen in popularity over the years, and it's honestly a very solid deck. For a while, I was, kind of underplaying this deck because I wasn't the biggest fan of it, but after seeing it more and more, it definitely puts up consistent results, and it is a very consistent deck. Usually when you look at some of these Constellar Artifact decks, it's just full of 3 and 2-ofs and stuff, and I'm going to put it in tier 2. It's definitely a solid deck. It's not necessarily super represented, but it is definitely very prevalent, and again, it's one of those things that, if anything, Pleiades did get somewhat of a buff in a sense. Being able to bounce things is just always very good, and in general, just a great deck. Next up, we have Mythic Ruler. Mythic Ruler is a very solid deck in my opinion. I guess, like, if we're looking at it in terms of, like, oh, if your opponent has the out, yes, Mythic Ruler does get hit really hard by Necro Valley now, simply because now cards just, I mean, it always got hit really hard by Necro Valley, but I feel like more now than ever, you might see Necro Valley in side decks a little bit more because of the harsher restriction, like even Necro Valley being able to stop the artifacts, whereas previously in like original Hat format, if you want to call it that, or what we were playing before these changes, obviously cards that leave the graveyard via their own effect were still able to trigger, so an artifact could summon itself out of the graveyard. But now with, you know, how it is, Necro Valley makes so no cards can leave in general. And as a result, it kind of feels like Mythic Ruler took a little bit of a hit in that sort of sense. With that being said, though, I am going to say that it is like a fan favorite deck, and it is a very good deck in general. So as a result, I am going to put this in the 1.5 category for those reasons. It's one of those decks I would expect to see a lot of, whether that's because it's a very good deck, it's a complicated deck, but at the same time, a lot of the older players, you know, crawl back to this deck just because of how good it is. Next up, we have Cyber Dragon Artifact. Personally, this is a really good deck. I do like it a lot, but the thing that I'll say with this is, like, even this, I believe it was this past year, Cyber Dragon Artifact won the online Hat format, like, championship, which is basically like our, you know, world championship in a sense for Hat format. And looking at it, I would say that this deck is probably somewhere around the 2.5 to 2 range. But in general, for, you know, the NAWCQ, what I'm going to say is this deck I feel is going to be very underrepresented. While it is a good deck and you should kind of have it on your radar, part of me wants to put this in the rogue category for that reason, but it could also sort of fall in the 2.5 category. I do think it is really good. I will put it in the 2.5 category, actually. It's a great deck. If someone does bring it and they know what they're doing, it's really, really good. And just in general, you know, it plays the artifacts, and artifacts are one of the best engines in, you know, all of Hat format. So there's not really any denying that. Next up, we have Mermail. Mermail always has been a very good deck with the changes in, you know, chain blocking and stuff like that. To an extent, Mermail is somewhat better, and even then, it's always just been a solid deck. It's the closest deck, in my opinion, to getting in the top picks category, but I'm going to actually put it in the 1.5 category. Just in general, I'm keeping specifically a couple decks for the top picks, but don't get me wrong, Mermail is definitely a top pick at that. After that, we have Hieratic Ruler. So Hieratic Ruler and Mythic Ruler are both very similar. Personally, I don't know how I feel about Hieratic Ruler as a whole. I think it, with modern builds how they've been, it definitely has helped with the consistency, but I feel like Mythic Ruler is slightly more consistent, and for that reason, I am going to put it one tier below Mythic Ruler. It's a great, great deck, don't get me wrong, but I feel like it is a little more reliant on opening well, and specifically, like, for example, things like Tefnuit force you to go and play second. But, you know, as I mentioned, in more modern Hat format, the thing that has been started being teched in this is cards like Reasoning, because it can kind of act as like a foolish or, you know, just a summon to start getting your plays going. And so I think that in general, 2 is a perfect number for that. And it's also, again, a fan favorite deck, so you could probably expect to see a good amount of that as well. After that, we have Spellbook. Spellbook actually did get a buff, because now, even though we have the same field spell, or like board, I should say, in Hat format that they kept the same, the one big change with this is now both players can each have their own field spell, rather than only being allowed to have one field spell on the field between both players. So this actually gives it a buff, and actually makes it a little harder to actually out the towers. And in general, you know, Spellbook was always a very good deck. It's extremely grindy, and once it gets going, it's really hard to stop. Spellbook of Fate is an amazing card, and so for that, I am going to put that in the 1.5 category. Again, you know, Mermail and Spellbook are both decks that could realistically put in the top picks category, But again, I would say they're slightly underrepresented compared to what I'm going to put in the top picks. Next up, we have Infernity. Infernity is going to be extremely controversial. I think Infernity is probably one of the scariest decks when going first, especially if it goes uninterrupted. And just in general, it's one of the few decks that has an Omni Negate. It has multiple disruptions. It's extremely a consistent deck. And, some people say that this encourages cheating and all that, but let's look at it in terms of, performance. This deck has actually declined slightly. And with that being said, I am going to put Infernity in the tier 2 category. Don't get me wrong, this deck is extremely good, and I think, honestly, this deck is going to be very, very represented. A lot of people think of Infernity when they think of H.A.T format, and so in terms of if this was a tier list saying how likely you are to see this deck, I would 100% put this in 1.5 or 2. No doubt about it, people are going to play Infernity. Now, the other thing is, Infernity is a fairly complicated deck. It's very similar to Mythic Ruler, where it has a lot of different lines. Even then, I would probably say, Infernity might be even considered a more difficult deck just because it has so many lines. If it gets disrupted, you need to know how to play through that and things of those sorts. Infernity is a very, very good deck, and it's going to be shown, but in terms of more recent times, the way deck building is, whether that's because of DD Crow being more relevant or Flying Sea and stuff like that, this will see somewhat of a decline if players know what they're doing and how to play against it. Next up, we have Geargia. This could be Geargia or Geargia Hands. Both are constantly showing results, and that is going to top picks. So as I mentioned, it did take the little bit of the hit with things specifically like Compulse for into the extra deck. So again, any deck that plays artifacts, if they can play these, bounce a Gear Gigant, it won't trigger or anything like that. But besides that, Geargia has always been a fan favorite deck. I like to joke around with my friends and say Geargia is the try-hard deck of the format. If, you talk to someone who used to play H.A.T format, most of the time they're going to jump to Geargia. It's just one of those decks that people really like. It's a really good deck, and in general, it's consistent and it shows results. Every time I do a tournament review, some form of Artifact Trap Tricks and some form of Geargia are always the top 2 spots in terms of the most represented, and I think that is going to 100% continue that trend. Next up, we have Bujin. Now, Bujin is one of those decks that unfortunately did take a very, very big hit, specifically being with, Bujingi Turtle. In H.A.T format, Turtle could activate in the damage step, but everywhere else in other formats, it was not able to. And why that's relevant is because cards like the Fire and Ice Hand would really hurt this deck. Ice Hand being because usually this deck would have some form of Tenki or something left on the board, and then other than that, Fire Hand obviously being able to just pop this, whereas Bujingi Turtle would be able to stop that. And with so many decks, as I mentioned, H.A.T plays the hands, and Geargia can play the hands and stuff like that, and there's several other decks that can, splash in hands in general. This did take a hit. Not to mention, if we're going back to, it does have a lot of graveyard effects, and Necro Valley is going to stop, all the grave stuff, as well as Valor is now going to be stopping the Yamato in the end phase, whereas before, if you got Valored during the end phase, the way it would work is you'd be able to make your opponent resolve the Valor, and then after that, you still have the end phase priority and stuff to be able to still get an add or send or whatever. So this did take a bit of a hit. And also, I guess, noting back to what I mentioned about Vanity's Emptiness and Kaiser, this was a deck that notoriously played those, but these cards have kind of fallen out because they're just not great when going second. They're definitely better side cards for this deck if you're choosing to play them, but even then, most topping lists are not going to be playing them. So that is something to sort of keep in mind. In general, though, this definitely is a 1.5 deck. And this might sound a little controversial, but part of me wants to put this in the tier 2 category specifically for this event. If you're playing in online H.A.T format tournaments or playing by the old rules, this definitely moves up a lot. It definitely goes to that 1.5 category and is kind of in the same route as, whether that be Mermail or Spellbook. But I think for this event specifically, and just in general, it is a slightly harder deck to pilot in if you're looking at it from a modern building perspective. I am going to put it here. Again, that's probably the most controversial opinion in my opinion for this, and I really hate to do that. I think, depending with the right pilot, it can go here, but I'm going to have to put it here for now. Next up, we have Lightsworn Ruler. Lightsworn Ruler is a very popular deck in Hat format. Back in 2014, it was really popular. That being said, it's not really the most consistent deck, and I feel it falls into the same category as Hieratic Ruler, where sometimes you just brick and you can't really do anything. It's a great deck. It still, gets hit by a handful of different cards, but in general, it's a very good deck, and you'll probably still see some just because people love Lightsworn Ruler, and if anyone's coming over from Edison, obviously Lightsworn's a big deck in Edison, so we could probably expect to see something along those lines. And so I am going to put this, I guess the ordering for this really doesn't matter, but I'll put it like right here for now. Next up, we have Ghostrix Spirits. This is just kind of a fun deck. A lot of people enjoy this deck. It's got tops from time to time, and it is a cool deck. It's very unexpected, but even then, this is going to be a rogue option. There's not really a whole lot to say with that. It's just, it's one of those decks that has consistency, but it's not necessarily the strongest deck in the room. And so, yeah, that's there's not really a whole lot to say with that. After that, we have Koikimiru Fire Fist. This one is interesting. This deck is a deck that took off a little more in modern Hat format and does see success, but I feel like, again, it's going to be one of those decks that's not really represented that much. You really have to have kind of a die-hard fan of the Koikimiru deck to really play this, and even then, it has its bad matchups like anything else, and it can be a little inconsistent, needing to, see the Iron Core and stuff like that. And for that reason, I want to put it almost in Rogue, but I feel like for now, I am going to put it in 2.5, whereas in Modern Hat, I might put it closer to the Tier 2 category for a handful of reasons. Next up, we have the Watt deck. This is a deck that actually more recently took off. It's like Watt Artifact Hunter, and it's a deck that will throw you off. If you've never played against this before, I would definitely suggest looking into it. I don't think it's going to be the most represented, but it is a very strong deck that a lot of people do not expect. And, just being able to play cards like the Watt Giraffe and then play it either a slow, grindy game with the Watts attacking directly and backing it up with the artifacts is extremely good. There's a lot to talk about with this deck. And with that being said, I am going to put this as a Tier 2 deck. I don't think it's going to be represented, so in terms of that, I might switch that down to like 2.5. But if people do show up with this and know what they're doing, it is a very strong option. After that, we have Fire King Fire Fist. This is another deck that is really cool. It can play Skill Drain, which is nice. It also can apply a lot of pressure, and just in general, it's a cool deck. But being a cool deck doesn't necessarily make it a great deck, and I kind of want to put this at 2.5, my apologies, with the Koikimiru deck. And it's kind of weird. I feel like both of these could almost go into the Rogue category with how they've kind of been not doing the greatest as of late, but they do have tops. For now, I'm going to put them both here. This could change, or just in general, keep in mind this could technically go into Rogue. Next up, we have Madolche. Madolche or Madolche Hands. Being able to play the hands is always very good, especially with the nerf they put to cards like Skullmeister. Obviously, in Hat format, Skullmeister can activate in the damage step, but now with the new rules, it is not able to. The thing with Madolche is it's one of those decks that kind of feels a little inconsistent at times. It's a really good deck, don't get me wrong, but yeah, it just feels slightly inconsistent at times. It can do a lot. When it goes off, it is scary, and I do think it's one of those decks that is a little underutilized. You'll probably see this at the event simply because it is a popular deck, but I am going to put it in 2.5. Again, just real quick, keep in mind all of these tiers are all very good. They're so similar to which the tier prior or anything like that. Again, a lot of these decks do have wins over the ones above it, and some of the ones below it or above it, constantly lose to the others. It's just a matter of, in general, how often we're seeing them. Next up, we have H.A.T. H.A.T is the, artifact trap tricks variant that plays card car rather than the hands. And this one's interesting because I think this deck is going to be very strong, specifically because of how wide the range of decks are going to be at this event. I think that the fact that H.A.T plays a lot of hand traps, it can easily play Maxi, it can easily play Crow, as well as obviously playing the artifacts and stuff like that and trap tricks. This is a very good deck. But that being said, it's I don't know if I would say that it is a top pick, but it's definitely very close. You're going to see this deck. Don't get me wrong, you will see it, but I'm going to put it in the 1.5 category just because I think a lot of people, if they're not sure of this deck, they're going to go with the hands over it. This deck has a tougher matchup against the hands, and I think in a way hands do have somewhat of a buff in this format. Specifically at, again, the NAWCQ, because there's a lot of more cards that, aren't able to be used the way you would want to actually out the hands. Hopefully that made sense. I feel like that came out sounding a little bit off there. Anyways, next up we have Gadgets. Gadget is a really good deck. I think people might try it, but I am going to just straight put it in Rogue. It's consistent for the most part. If you're playing the chain summoning version, it's really, really cool, and it can really pop off. I don't see that many people actually going out of their way to play this. And for that reason, I am going to put it there, but it is a cool deck, and it definitely has a lot of possibility there. Next up, we have Evil Swarm. So this is probably the one that I'm not sure where to put it. This is a deck that loses really, really hard to the hands and was, notoriously known to play Skullmeister. Now, obviously, losing that is a pretty hurtful thing. And I guess, yeah, it just becomes one of those interesting things because cards like Ophions are really, really good. That can hurt Mermail, that can hurt, the Spellbook deck not being able to summon High Priestess. It can hurt Lightsworn Ruler, any of the ruler decks in general, I guess I should say. It's one of those decks that was so close to being like, I want to say like a solid like tier 2 deck in H.A.T, but it also just hasn't performed as much. And now with the extra hit it kind of is taking by not having Skullmeister, it does somewhat hurt it. Do I think you'll see this deck? You probably still will, and it is a solid deck. I'm going to put it, right in the middle here at 2.5, though I could also see it somewhat slipping into Rogue. The only reason I say that this deck might see a little more play is it can play a lot of floodgates, and also there's still cards like Forbidden Dress that kind of help with the protection, though it's not quite the same. So for that reason, I am going to put it there. Next up, we have Heraldic. Heraldic is a really good deck. It's a deck that I enjoy a ton. It's kind of one of those surprise decks. It can play the hands, it can play floodgates like Skill Drain, and it is consistent at doing what it does. That being said, it's not really the most known deck in terms of, the older player base and stuff like that. So you might see one or two, but I feel like people aren't really looking towards this deck. And for that reason, I am going to say I hate putting this in Rogue when these are, in 2.5, because I do think Heraldic is kind of closer to being a better deck, though these do, I think in theory right now, they might have more tops than Heraldic. But Heraldic, again, it's a really good deck, and it could technically be in like the 2.5 category, but for now, just with how things are, I'm going to put it in Rogue. Next up, we have Sylvan. Sylvan is in an interesting spot. This deck is a really good deck, but at the same time, it can be a little bricky. It is, one of the cool decks that can actually take advantage of cards like Rivalry, which is a great card. It stops a lot of different decks. The same way, Spellbook can take advantage of Rivalry. And I guess one thing to note with Spellbook is Spellbook can also play Effect Veiler really well because it's a spellcaster. So, they kind of gain that if some people want to try, playing Veiler. But anyways, back to Sylvan. Yeah, Sylvan is just one of those decks. It can apply a lot of pressure quickly. It can easily make Divine Dragon Knight Felgran, which is a very scary card. But overall, I want to say that Sylvan has kind of taken a little bit of a dive over the years in terms of, consistent play. I still want to say that it is like a tier 2 deck and a very solid one at that. I guess, yeah, no, it's a very good deck, and it's definitely going to be represented. Like, in terms of representation, you're definitely going to see Hat, you're definitely going to see Geargia, you might see Cat, you're probably going to see, Spellbook, Mermail, Mythic Ruler, Bujin is still going to be seen a lot of play, Infernity, Sylvan. You may or may not see Constellar Artifact, Lightsworn Ruler you'll probably see Hieratic Ruler. You more than likely are not going to see that much Watt Artifact. Geargia Karakuri has a chance to be seen a good amount. Cyber Dragon Artifact you'll probably not see the most. Evil Swarm is 50-50 as well. Madolche, you might see one or two. These decks, you might see one or two, but it's on the lower end, and same with the rogue options. Now, obviously, don't quote me on this. There's no way to really know how the format is going to shape up for this event with all these changes. This is just my opinion on it. And anyways, I don't know why I accidentally had another Yamato there. Lastly, I want to talk about Gravekeeper Artifact. Now, how I mentioned with the Necro Valley errata, this deck is completely dead. But that being said, I think that pure Gravekeeper with the buff from Necro Valley actually does have a chance. And the other thing to note is, going back to this Fossil Dyna, I could definitely see a deck that just plays a lot of Floodgates, as well as, a lot of times you would see a more stun type deck. I could definitely see something like that being a surprise factor and actually popping up. But for the most part, if I were to put this in a category, I don't know if anyone's actually going to show up with just pure Gravekeeper, because as I mentioned, Gravekeeper Artifact cannot play in this format. Just because of, the errata with Necro Valley. But in general, if this wasn't with that, then obviously this deck is a very strong deck, and I would want to put this somewhere along the lines of like tier 2 or tier 2.5 realistically. But obviously, if we're talking NAWCQ, I cannot do that. But anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Again, you can let me know what you think in the comment section down below, as well as checking out some of the other videos that I show off. You can check out gameplay deck profiles for all of these decks shown on my channel. I'll have all of that linked in the video description down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it, comment any questions or videos you want to see in the future, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out, and share this video with your friends. And anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.